It's our pleasure to have our first speaker today, Anja Feldmann from Max Planck Institute. So we're the slide. Anja is joining us from Max Planck Institute, and she has a PhD from Carnegie Mellon, and she did work with AT&T Research and several other universities, Saarland University, TU Berlin, TU Munich, and she is also a CM fellow, and also she has the recipient. She's the recipient of several awards, and let me read those because it's hard for me. IEEE Koji Kobayashi Award, also Konrad Zuse Medal of the German Computer Science Society. So please join me in welcoming the Professor Anja Feldmann.
Thanks a lot for the invitation here to be able to give a keynote to all of you. And it's great to see so many people here in person and not just online. I really have to say that, because a conference without actually personal interactions just isn't any kind of conference. So this is very, very valuable. I think you need to turn down the volume a bit because, right. So my talk is going to be about internet traffic analysis at scale. But before I get there, I want to give you a little bit of background in terms of how did I get to choose this kind of topic. So I did my undergraduate at the University of Paderborn. And at that point, I was basically interested in algorithms because, hey, computer science, algorithms, well, that's one of the basic elements. Then I decided, well, my mother at some point said, don't you want to go somewhere else? And I was like, no, Paderborn is great. This small little city. Why should I change? Well, then I got closer to graduation with my diploma. So it was a diploma, not a master's at the time. And then I said, okay, yeah, why not try something? And I actually went long distance. I actually went to the US because it was like really exciting. And Carnegie Mellon offered me a scholarship and it was great. And one of the advice that I got at the time was, hey, if you want to go somewhere, do it right. Don't just do it as a one-year visit, but actually apply to a PhD program and do it all the way. Of course, my mother, once I told her, hey, I'm going to stay there, I'm going to do my whole PhD there, was like, oh man, she didn't know what she had gotten into at that point. I was still doing algorithms, but at some point, I did all this worst case analysis and I said, hey, how is the internet traffic actually looking like? And that's when I started my first internet measurement. And this is when we basically instrumented our local floor to collect our first data and started the data analysis there. And this was the time when all this similarity stuff came up and we verified it, etc. Then I actually went to AT&T. And I joined the theory group there as a postdoc, but I joined 1127. And at the time, there was this whole split of AT&T into AT&T Bell Labs and Lucent and all those kinds of things. And since I was the newest member, I was the one keeping track of who wanted to go where, which was kind of weird because I actually didn't know what all of these kinds of things. So then I became much more of a networking researcher there, because actually, even as a theoretician, I was the person that had probably some of the most background in terms of doing data analysis. And that's when we actually started out putting packet monitors into the AT&T network, gathering data and all those kinds of things. And it was basically an opportunity. And this is one of the things that I probably want to tell all these young people sitting here. Hey, if you see an opportunity, take it, because you never know where it comes out of it. And for me, at least, it worked out very nicely. So we did do all this kind of data analysis, etc. Then I also learned a lot about networking, because there were all these guys that actually knew a lot about it. And one of the things is, hey, why do people ask always, why do we need to analyze this network? Well, I say it's actually science in the sense that people study nature, they study all these biology systems, they do medicine and all those things, but there they have the disadvantage, they actually don't know the system that they are studying. In network, we actually have a highly engineered system. So we should know what the heck is going on. But can anybody claim here that they understand the internet? I certainly can't. So the challenges that we are facing are, it's growing, it's changing. There's constantly new applications coming up, which pretty much means that we won't run out of work, which is also good. There are new things happening, new security holes coming up, and we have a highly interacting system. And if we explain to somebody what we are doing, the challenge that I always ask them, hey, what would you do if the internet would stop working? And most people wouldn't know what to do anymore, at least after a day or two. And actually, our economy would probably suffer substantially. So, meaning we have plenty of stuff to do. Now, once you go beyond being a PhD student, people are probably going to ask you, so what is your approach to doing the work that you want to do? And I think it's really important to figure out what is your unique capabilities in terms of what you can do. And my unique capability is that I still have a lot of background in algorithms, so that when I look at a problem, I can say, this is how I can actually solve this kind of stuff. Now, what do? We basically start out with data. So collecting data, being able to get data is one of the crucial elements to our work. Now, oftentimes we cannot do that just by ourselves, but actually we have to talk to people so that they are willing to share the data with us. Now, how do you get people to share data? Well, you prove that you can do things that other people may not be able to do and that you can help them. Now, most of the time, once you've proven that already with one company, it's much easier to get the other company to also believe that you can do something. So establish some kind of a background in terms of being able to do things in order to move forward on these kinds of things. And a lot of people come to me and say, hey, can't you share your data with me? And I often have to say, no. Because they usually don't have a track record in terms of doing any kind of data analysis. So they don't understand where the data is coming from. They don't understand the caveats in the data. Then they say, but how can we go about it? Well, the first thing is talk to your local university administration whether you can't get access to some kind of data there and get started with it. Or do an internship with people where there is data. So people are often willing to help you, but it requires effort and it requires people to actually go ahead and do these kinds of steps. Now, once you have the data, you need to analyze it. These days, AI methods are all the big things to do it. I still remember when some other algorithmic methods came up and people were starting to use them all over the place. Well, some of the statements there were, hey, if you don't know what you're doing, you might as well use these methods. If you know what you're looking for, why do you want to use them? So if you want to use AI methods to actually identify spikes, well, you might as well look for your spikes directly. Think about where and when to use it. Apply the techniques with actually thought behind it. Now, the big advantage of the internet is we know how it's supposed to look like. So if you have some kind of a hypothesis in terms of how things are looking like, you might as well actually verify it, use simulations, and make sure that this is indeed what you're saying. And then you can think about optimizations, how to change things, and how to move forward on that. And this is basically some of the things that I learned while I was at AT&T and which I've been taking advantage of all the time ever since then. So at that point, I suddenly became an offer for joining the University of the Saarland. And yeah, it was actually a lot of fun. And I really enjoyed that. Then Saarbrücken became a little bit small for me. And I actually decided to move to Munich. And then Deutsche Telekom Labs came ahead and said, hey, we want to build this new lab. Why don't you come and join us in Berlin? Now, the big advantage of that move was being able to interact directly with the company again. Because being at a university, there is somewhat of a disconnect between understanding what the problems in the real industry are versus the ones that you have, what you can see at the university. And being able to make that connection again was extremely useful for me. Now, whenever you build up a new lab, things are really nice. But like with all these research labs, there is this lab affair when everything is really good, looking good. And then things become more financial, tight, more restricted, and all those kinds of things. So in the end, it turned out that moving to Max Planck was one of the great opportunities there. Now, you already saw that I pointed out that I have another hobby there, and that is at some point at T-Labs, some of my students basically showed me this little horse, wooden horse, and said, don't just spend all your time at the lab. And that is when they actually didn't know what they got into it, because I actually got some real horses at that time. And since then, I've really taken advantage of the fact that you shouldn't work 24 hours a day because it actually doesn't make you more productive. So another recommendation is make sure that you actually do something else beyond just working, because less hours is sometimes much more productive than more hours. Now, we are at the Max Planck Institute of Informatics and have built up a nice group over there. And we're doing various different work in all these different areas. But the main thing that you will see is that a lot of the work that we do relies on being able to look at data at scale, and analyzing it. Now, I've brought along a couple of projects over here. We may not be able to cover all of these, but you can talk to me about these afterwards. So, COVID-19 and the internet. That is the first topic I want to address. Well, COVID-19 kind of came out of more or less nowhere, and it actually changed our life quite drastically. Now, the internet actually was a big enabler to overcome some of the problems that we were facing. So we asked ourselves, did it do well? And it was like, hey, it happened. And then the IMC deadline was not too long afterwards. And we said, can we actually get our act together and analyze it from different perspectives in the time that we have until the IMC deadline? And yes, we did. And this was an effort of quite a number of people. And it was only possible because we had different people with different data sources to be able to view things from different perspectives. So, the vantage points. We had 3 internet exchange points. So this is where the different internet providers come together to exchange traffic on a layer 2 platform. We had an ISP, and we actually had an edu network. And by being able to combine these different views, you have more opportunities than just looking at one of these. So if you look at this kind of a graph over here, you will see that the usage kind of goes regularly, then you have some kind of an increase. Now you had the outbreak over here, and then you had the initial response, you had the lockdown, and then it kind of continued. So typically you have a rise in traffic of about 30 to 35%. And within this lockdown over here, the amount of traffic growth that you had was pretty much within a few days the thing that you usually have within a whole year, quite drastically. And this is not just true for one of these networks, it's actually true for all of them. Well, not quite. For the mobile network, you actually see an opposite trend, because people were actually staying at home, so they were using Wi-Fi rather than the mobile network. And this kind of continued along with multiple lockdowns coming later on. Now you may say, well, if there's so much more traffic, how was the network able to cope with that? Well, one of the things to understand is that most of these networks are actually engineered for the busy hour. And the lucky element here was that this traffic increase didn't necessarily happen during the busy hour, but actually during the regular work hours. So this is on a Wednesday, the typical traffic pattern that you have. Oops. So it kind of in the night is decreasing during the day, it's slowly increasing, and then in the evening you have the busy hour. This is a weekend day. When people are more at home, you see more activity during the day. And this is during the lockdown. And you pretty much see that the regular days start to look much more like the weekend days. And this is good, because it means that most of the traffic was actually happening in these kinds of hours and not during the peak times. So does it look like the same over time? Well, you basically can classify things as normal traffic as expected over here, or the unusual patterns. And this is basically the lockdown, and it kind of continues. Now, after the lockdown, now you still see some effects over here, which might have to do also with holidays. If you continue on looking at it with further lockdowns, more of these things happened again. Now you can also look at what changed in terms of traffic. And so what we have over here is we basically have a base week at the ISB very early on. And so you do see the gaming, which is kind of peaking during the night. You see some of the other things. And this is all normalized by min-max of the 3 weeks that we're going to take a look at. Here we have email during working hours, CDN and voice on demand gaming during the evening hours, and then hardly any web conferencing. Basically, people didn't know Zoom before the lockdown. And now we're all on Zoom. So not surprisingly, all of those are peaking red. April, growth in email less pronounced, somewhat a decrease in social media. In June, web conferencing, it's still there. We're still living with it. Still, some of these effects are very much visible. Now, overall, what you can see is that changes in people's life lead to actually new traffic patterns. More applications are coming up. And so we saw a traffic increase of 15 to 30% within a few days, which is very unusual. Yet the valleys got filled, which is why, if the networks could react quickly, they were actually able to cope with it. Now, were all networks able to cope with it? No. Only those that are well managed, that had some reserve capabilities, and that could actually take whatever traffic capacity they had and put it into play. So automatic network management, being prepared to look at the data, to actually react on it, is critical to actually deal with such kind of exceptional events. Now, this was kind of a study of how human behavior influences network management and the other way around. The next topic I want to talk to is something that we haven't published yet, and where we are basically looking at how to relate digital to analog footprints. And the point there being is on the analog side, you have demographics, you have hate crime, you have voting behavior, immigration. On the digital side, you have social media, we have our internet traffic, etc. And people want to relate these two together. They also want to know, where are people living? And one of these groups are expats, meaning those that are actually not working in the country where they are growing up. And they do have a huge impact on society, which is why this is of interest. And one of the questions that we were asking is, can we use internet traffic to infer in which area of Germany some of these expats are living? So how do people usually do it? Well, there's the census. Census is one of these annoying things where they actually come to your door and ask you about your background. It's not very accurate. It's out of date usually. And so the question is, can we do better? Now, other people have used social media, but that is also problematic because you're basically paying Facebook to do advertisement and other kinds of things to try to infer some of these things. So we were asking, can we actually use raw internet data? And the way that we're going for it is by basically utilizing the top-level domain information that is in the URLs. Now, if you look at the URL, you can see there's the protocol, there's the subdomains, then there's a domain name. And there's a top-level domain, which gives you some indication of the country that this information will be related to. Now, if you look at that space of domains, there are probably some that are related to France, Austria, or the UK. Now, you have those that are then .france, .uk. They may or may not overlap. But most likely, some people that are actually from a specific country still access some websites that are hosted in these top-level domains because they have a relationship to that country. Of course, other people that are visiting may also do this, but probably not quite as regular and probably a different subset of sites. And so we asked ourselves the question, can we identify some of these kinds of domains that might be used as an indicator of expats? And yes, the answer is yes. Now, how do we know that? Well, we can use the census data in order to determine, do we find a correlation there? And we can ask, what kind of correlation can we find for different countries? And so we looked at the European data, and we basically looked at the German registry data, who tracks it on a per Kreis basis. For example, you see a sample here. And then you have the information for Austria. So we have Austria here, we have France, and you see the digital estimates, and you see the census estimates. We have Poland, we have Spain, and Austria. And for example, Austria, well, in Bavaria, there are apparently many more Austrians living, which is to be expected. Same with France, that in Baden-Württemberg, you also have more people from France living. And so the correlations are actually quite substantial, hinting that these kinds of things are probably quite reasonable. Now, why do we need to subselect domains? Why wouldn't you just take all domains from a specific top-level domain area? Well, if you take all of them, then you get the results that are outlined over here. So you see, some of them have very bad correlation, especially for the United Kingdom, for example, or Spain. On the other hand, if you subselect domains, your correlations will substantially improve. And that hints at the fact that some of these domains are of regular interest to all kinds of internet users. Others are more likely to be relevant only to the experts. So what are the main parts that people are interested in? It's basically entertainment, technology, business, economy, news. So what did we learn? Geographic interest actually relates and correlates with census data. News, general goods, multimedia are among the top level domains that are relevant here. Now you ask, okay, we looked at some of the projects related to COVID-19. We looked at digital analog footprints. If you look at internet traffic, there's also lots and lots of traffic that shouldn't be there. So can we actually find and identify, classify that kind of traffic and learn from that? And so we are also doing some security-related work, but again, mainly driven based on network data. And the way I first got into this whole network security element was, well, I had a PhD student that came to me and said, hey, I'm actually interested in security. Can we do that? And I said, no. He was disappointed. And I said, well, we may be able to do something with network security. And he said, okay, that sounds interesting. Let's try this. And at that point, I also started a collaboration with Van Paxson because he knows about network security and I knew about network traffic. And we basically worked together on BRO, the intrusion detection system, which by now is known under a different name, but still active and still ongoing. And that was my way in which I could actually reach out from doing network traffic analysis more into the security domain, where I'm still not an expert in security, but I know about network data and how it relates to security elements. So one of the things, if you don't know something about a specific area, find a collaborator that does, so that you can actually better interpret the data and can move forward on this. Now, the other option is also, if you find somebody that you want to work with, but that's working on a different topic, well, find something that is in the intersection of your two expertise so that you can combine your expertise to actually work on that problem. And that is also something that has worked out very nicely. So the project that I want to talk about is the question of a meta-telescope. You guys know what a telescope is? Who knows what a telescope is? To watch stars or to watch network traffic? Well, if you look at the internet telescopes, what we have is we basically have the announced IP address space. For example, here a /16, 29.172. Well, if it's actually unused and announced, then there shouldn't be any traffic. So it's a darknet, because it shouldn't receive any traffic. But actually, there are so many people scanning in the internet, there's so much backscatter traffic, etc., that this is not true. You actually do see traffic. And that is the so-called background radiation or internet background radiation traffic, IBR. Because there might be these evil researchers over here that say, let's scan everything. And they are, of course, also hitting the darknets. And it's not just the evil researchers or the good researchers that are using ZMAP, but it's pretty much also the bad guys. It's also when you're doing SYN attacks, DDoS attacks, etc., with spoofed IP addresses, then the spoofing usually also involves some of these addresses from these dark networks. And so the answers are getting back to the dark networks. So the analog is, just like with real telescope, you can use these internet telescopes to watch network traffic that shouldn't be there. You're seeing the radiation. The problem, though, is you need address space to do this. And especially IPv4 address space is becoming really, really valuable and rare. So you don't have a lot of address space that you can just announce. In addition to that, the bad guys know where some of the internet telescopes are. So the CADA telescope, for example, is fairly well known, and some people actually avoid those addresses on purpose. So we asked ourselves, can't we do something else with it? Because you have all these use cases. People want to use these because they can see who is scanning, what are the new swarms that are happening, where are things coming from, so you can actually characterize attack vectors. Can we run a telescope without actually owning the prefix? And the answer is, because you might guess it by now, is of course yes. Because why would I use such kind of a rhetorical question if I wouldn't be able to answer this here with yes? Why is that the case? Well, if you don't see any regular traffic going to a prefix, but only the scan traffic, then you know, hey, that shouldn't be there. So you can actually use that to identify this bad traffic. So the point being here that you can actually take a look at operational telescope networks over here. And by using vantage point inside the network, you can see, hey, what traffic is going there. And you can also find these meta telescopes from these vantage points in the internet, because you can see, hey, there is no real traffic coming from it at these points over here. So these must be quote unquote dark networks, unused address space, even though they are announced. So what is the idea? The idea is that we use telescopes to infer what kind of characteristic of traffic would we expect to see going to a telescope. Once we know that, we can actually use the traffic at IXPs or ISPs to infer unused IP address space. Once we have that, we can actually do insights and analysis of this. Okay. How do we infer telescope characteristics? Well, take a look at existing telescope data. So we had 3 telescopes, 2 in Europe, 1 in the US, various different prefix sizes, and we had 24 hours of data to look at this. Now, as expected, there should not be any outbound traffic, because if there is outbound traffic, well, then it's not a telescope. Inbound, it's pretty much all TCP SYNs, or almost all. Also, almost all small packet size, and usually not too much traffic. Now, to infer the meta telescopes, we basically use data from 14 different IXPs spread around Europe, North America, Asia, all of different sizes, and we had sampled flow data. So what did we do here? Well, we applied different filters according to what we learned earlier. Recall, these are some of the characteristics that we should be seeing. And this is exactly what we are filtering for. We are filtering for TCP, average, fairly small, no outbound traffic, preserved private address space, globally routed, and a packet count less than 1.7 million. And you can see how the number of subnets that we considered is slowly decreasing. So we started out with about 6 million and then ended up with about 5 million, and could kind of see about 400K dark nets, some which are kind of mixed and some gray nets. So once we look at this by vantage point, by different IXPs, we can look at the total, which is down below. So all the combined one, we have about 318 different subnets that we can identify as dark in lots and lots of different ASs, in lots and lots of different countries. The largest IXP actually contributed a lot to it. You can also see, though, that by adding some of the other data, some of the previously dark networks become gray, because you may actually see some data being originated from these. The second largest one had the ones in the most different number of ASs. So what do we have? Well, we have a set of candidates. Now, once you have a set of candidates, well, you need to validate things. So the question is, how can you validate these kinds of inferences? Well, we actually know about certain darknets, and we can now see, can we actually identify them? And here we have the Hilbert knot of an IPv4 address space, a subset of it. And these are the telescope address space boundary that is known to be a telescope. So all these prefixes within that boundary here is indeed a known telescope. And the points in blue show you where we infer to be a meta-telescope. Now you see that almost all of them are within that circle. You also see that we don't see some of them. Well, they may not have been scanned within the time period that we looked at. So it's not too surprising that we don't see all of them. In addition to that, we see 2 dots outside. Well, that is also quite reasonable, because those might be /24s that are unused, that are not actually used, where there are no servers behind it or no clients. So this is actually pretty much matches what we would expect. This is another known telescope, and then the found usage phase. Now, where are these meta-telescopes? Well, they are pretty much everywhere. And that is a big, big, big advantage of this approach, because the traditional telescopes are very much limited to the US and Europe. We don't have any in Asia or in any of the African countries. With the meta-telescopes, we suddenly have many more opportunities. Now, you might ask, are things consistent? Do we see the same kind of characteristics? And one of the typical characteristics to look like for are things like port usages. Now, on the left-hand side, you see the information for the actual telescopes. On the right-hand side for the meta-telescope. Now you see some differences over here, and they have to do with the fact that there are actually some ports that are not able to be used on some of the telescopes. So there is some filtering, but you also see significant overlap. Now, what can we conclude from this? Well, meta-telescopes can be used, and we call this a meta-telescope because it's not a real telescope, because the owner of the IP address space doesn't have to collaborate here. And we can combine information from many different prefixes in many different countries. So we can find them around the globe, all network types, and pretty much any network where you see these IBR traffic can be used to infer these meta-telescopes, which gives us completely new measurement capabilities. All right, so much for this project. Hey, we still have time, amazingly. So I can even talk about the next topic, and that is congestion control. Now, wait a moment. What does congestion control have to do with data? What is this whole thing about internet traffic analysis at scale, and congestion control. Well, one of the things that we should know is that congestion control certainly defines or kind of influences how traffic flows through the internet and how much traffic of which flow can make it. Now, you can also see, hey, people are actually analyzing congestion control algorithms in very, very artificial settings. What is the standard setup in which congestion control algorithms are evaluated? Can somebody help me here? What's the standard setup? How many different flows are being looked at? Less than 5? More than 5? Who is for less than 5? Who is for more than 5? That doesn't correspond to the internet. And that is one of the things where I think we need to reevaluate how to actually look at congestion control algorithms and how to compare them. And we are working towards some kind of a setup which will allow us to actually evaluate congestion control algorithms in many more different scenarios in a semi-automated way. And to do so, we actually looked, and to get experience with this kind of a setup, we looked at BBR. And BBR v3 has a lot of promises, lots of potential, and we asked ourselves, do these promises and potential actually hold? So, how does BBR work? BBR basically has two phases, where it basically tries to evaluate on a regular basis how much bandwidth is available and what is the current RTT. It's being used by Google, YouTube, etc. And in 2019, 22% of Alexa's top 20K websites already use BBR, and it's responsible for a significant fraction of the traffic. So BBR v1 was set up in 2016. And there were already some signs that there might be some problems there. So if you look at cubic versus BBR, you see that the red curve completely drops down, cubic traffic, and the green curve comes up. And this is not just true if you have a single BBR flow, but also when you on the single cubic flow, but also when you have 16 cubic flows versus one BBR flow, you still see a lot of unfairness. Now the question is fairness really desired? Well, that is something that we all need to answer. So Google reacted, designed BBR v2, which reacts to loss and ECN and adjusts the parameters to become more fair. And there were some papers there looking at these things. And if you look at the fair share, well, at that point, BBR v2 was probably below the fair share element. So Google went ahead, designed BBR v3, which is a minor improvement on BBR v2. It's supposed to fix bandwidth convergence. It has with and without loss and or ECN marks. And it's supposed to be performance tuning. Supposedly it has better coexistence with cubic and Rhino, lower retransmission rate, reduced latencies for different buffer configurations. Those are the promises that Google comes up with. And we decided to check this. Now, how do we check this? Well, we are using this simple dumbbell, but with the opportunity to actually introduce more than just 5 or 10 flows. We can actually generate flows according to all kinds of heavy tail distributions, look at their performance as well. But before we even get there, we have to do some basic checks. Now, what are some of the parameters? Well, different buffers, different traffic, different sizes, different delays. And once you realize that, you realize that there are tons and tons of different dimensions along which one has to actually evaluate congestion control algorithms, and that it's not that simple to come up with one benchmark that is going to cover all of these. And of course, you also realize that it's very simple for people to cherry pick results where their congestion algorithm is going to look really, really good. And they hardly ever point to the points where their CCA is actually not doing so well. So what are the evaluation scenarios? Well, we need to look at intra-CCA fairness, RTT fairness, coexistence with other loss-based CCRs, and real-world network traffic. And I just want to give you some sample results to kind of highlight where some of these CCRs may or may not benefit. So is BBR-V3 fair to itself? Well, if both of these flows are starting at the same time, it actually looks pretty okay. But how often is that the case? What happens if they don't start at the same time? Oops. It suddenly takes a long time before it converges. So with just 15 seconds apart, it actually does take a long time before they converge, especially when you have deep buffers. If the buffers are not as deep, it may not take this long. So convergence to the same share takes significantly longer when the flows don't start at the same time, which is the more realistic scenario in the internet. What about flows with different RTTs? Well, we can take a look at the elements where you have a higher bandwidth for share for the long-lived RTT flows. Those are up here and the other way down there. So cubic is unfair to those flows that have a longer RTT because they can't react as quickly. BBR is actually unfair to those flows that have the shorter RTT. And it's significantly more unfair. BBR-V3 didn't change anything, even though they claimed they want to actually improve this. Now you can also look at the Jane's Fairness Index. And you can see that BBR-V3 didn't really change much depending on what the buffer sizes are. So you basically have on the x-axis over here, the different congestion control algorithms and the bandwidth delay product on the y-axis here. You have it for different RTTs. And you see that if the differences between the RTTs are not as drastic, things do improve. But you basically have a bias towards long RTTs here. So does BBR-V3 coexist well with cubic? Well, no, it doesn't. And I don't want to go into all the details here, but if you're interested, you can take a look at the corresponding PALM paper. Then we asked, what about more realistic workloads? And so over here, you have the different flow sizes on the x-axis and the flow completion time on the y-axis. And for example, when you have BBR-V1 versus cubic, you clearly see that BBR benefits because it hogs all the bandwidth. BBR-V2, well, some of the unfairness goes away for the small flows, but for the bigger flows, it still exists. BBR v3, well, for the small flows, it's actually more or less the same, but for the bigger flows, it still is there. So once you take a closer look at it, you can see that not all the things are that simple, and that pretty much all congestion control algorithms do make some trade-offs. And we need to decide as community and as service providers which ones of these we want to actually use. But for that, we should understand where some of these performance trade-offs are coming from. So, in summary, I told you about 4 different elements of work that are ongoing within our lab. And with that, I'm actually open for questions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for the inspiring and informative talk. So questions, yeah. Anybody has questions? Okay. So I'm gonna throw this to you. Can you hold it? Are you ready? Okay.
Thanks. Thanks, Anja. Very, very nice. Just picking up on the last BBR part, because the test sub shows more or less a dumbbell setup, which is still limiting understanding. On the other hand, it's important to have the understanding what happens there. But do you have ideas how to sort of extend that into a broader scale network case, and then might be able to understand what happens in the real settings?
Well, so there are different scenarios. So this scenario captures the fact when you have a single bottleneck. But of course, in the internet, you often also have multiple bottlenecks. And so that's the second scenario that I think you need to consider, where you actually do have 2 bottlenecks that you can actually subject different kinds of traffic to. And also the question is, what kind of bottleneck traffic do you have? Because that also makes a difference. Because if you have elastic flows that are competing with you on the bottleneck, you have a different scenario than if you have a hard cut down on that. And yes, we do have scenarios for that as well, and we're also evaluating it in this case. And we will have some kind of a release of software at some point, which will allow you to actually test your congestion control algorithm in all these kinds of scenarios.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Over there. Okay.
Kemal?
Kemal.
Kemal?
Oh. Expected.
Thank you very much. I want to ask a different question, not technical, about the access to data. So you have access to that IXP data, right?
We
Do this
are
type of
working with
analysis.
people that have access to the IXP data, and with internships, we actually do have access to the data.
So I'm trying
yes.
to understand the role of universities to do this type of research without without collaborating with such IXPs or ISPs. You gave examples from Google. They have developed this protocol. They also had Quick protocol, right? These are all coming from industry, not really university. So how do you see the university's role to contribute to this type of research without really having access to the data, number one? Number two is the other way. When you do the analysis that you show, the first analysis. So this type of analysis can be done by authoritarian governments. So how do you, like, for instance, you analyze a group of people's characteristics of internet usage. So you can easily expand it to other types of analysis. If authoritarian governments would like to use this type of data, how is it possible to achieve that type of deep analysis?
Okay, the first question is regarding access to data and working on problems that are basically company driven. Now, Google and some of the other big companies have hired lots and lots of great researchers to actually work with them on some of the problems that they are facing on a daily basis. Because if you look at the Google networking group, they have lots and lots of excellent researchers there. Now, their problem usually is that their day job is slightly different than actually publishing. Their day job is to really kind of go into depth into improving the services that are there. Now, that means that they usually don't have time to do some of the work that we may be able to do. So how do you get access to some of the problems? Well, one of the things is spend your sabbatical with them or other kind of places, or establish a good co-working relationship with them. Send your students there as interns, because that is also how they get to know access to the data and as well as being able to know what the problems are. But once they come back, you can benefit from it, because they usually don't finish the project within the internship time, and then some of the things will still continue on, and everybody can benefit from it. Now, that is for companies such as Google, but there are also other companies there where there are lots of people that have lots and lots of data, but don't have the time to actually look at that. And there, it is very easy to, even as a university group, set up a collaborationship where both benefit, because you benefit by getting access to the data, they benefit by getting insights about their data. And that is what I've usually done. The other part is, for example, for one of the IXPs, they have had PhD students that were working within their group, and I've been their PhD advisor. So that is also another possibility there. Or it's just people that are aware of, hey, we have lots of data, but we don't have the time. You seem to have the capability of doing it. Don't you want to take a look? The other part is get some of your PhD students to actually found data analysis companies and that then actually work with some of the data and establish the data, and you still have a good relationship to them, so that you still have ongoing collaborations there. So that's another part that works. But the main part is find a way to actually prove that you can do data analysis. And this can be done even with active measurements. It doesn't have to be done with passive ones. Pretty much everybody can do active measurements. Go ahead and do something. Talk to your local network provider, whether you can't get access to some of their data. This is actually, when I first came to Saarbrücken, I negotiated as part of my startup package there that I could actually be able to do packet monitoring on their uplink. The same when I moved to Munich. I negotiated with the Lab Inspection Zentrum there that we could actually do some monitoring of the data, because access to data was one of the key elements to me. Now, with some of the analysis capabilities and the possibilities that we can show, that might be of interest to certain agencies, of course. Security-wise, for other kinds of studies. But luckily, most of the time, these people don't have the time and the capabilities of actually doing it. And so in that sense, I think we are fairly safe, especially with regards to some of the European countries. I think the laws with regards to what certain companies and certain people can do with the analysis, we are on a fairly safe side. And just because you have capabilities doesn't mean that things have to be done, which is also why in our study, we are limiting ourselves to certain questions which we believe are not quite as critical as looking at other subgroups. And yes, it's somewhat limiting, but that's being done on quite a purpose basis.
You had a second question too. Be careful. Whoa! Okay, let's do that.
It's nice that nothing happens to the mic, but what are the damages in between?
Okay, thanks for the talk. I have a question regarding the digital versus analog footprint. You're looking at the top level domains, if I got it right.
Yeah.
In the DNS entries. What are you doing So, and I understand that this is one of the areas where you think that we in future can somehow get something out of internet data that we can use like classic sensors as an alternative to conventional sensors. But in the future, more and more of these traffic will likely be encrypted, right? If you look at dot and do, so DNS over TLS, DNS over HTTPS, then this information isn't available anymore. Or am I missing something?
Well, we are already dealing with packet sampling, so we are already seeing a sample element. And yes, people that are, of course, not using the local DNS server, we won't be able to identify here.
But there has even, hasn't there in the US been an extension, for example, from Firefox that it by default is using a central DNS and not a local one?
Well, so far, only about 5% of the users are using some kind of encryption as far as I know, but this is likely to increase. And Firefox is not the default browser of almost all people.
All right, more questions? I think one more, let's take one more because for the sake of time.
All right. Thank you for the talk. Following up a previous question, your internet measurements are quite impressive from a scale that often intelligence agencies can only reach. So what are your measures with respect to privacy and what are your ethical considerations on that?
So ethics plays an important role in all of the things that we are doing over here. We cannot report and analyze individual characteristics, period. We can only report aggregate information, which is really, really critical. This is also why, for example, all the information that we are doing over here for the analog versus digital is on a CRISE basis. So a huge aggregation level. And that is really, really important. Now, with regards to privacy, all people that are dealing with the data have to understand that they're basically at the same level as system administrator. And I actually talk to them separately to basically ensure that they understand what their responsibility is. Because if anybody violates that at any point in time, none of these things will be possible anymore. Now, regarding privacy of the data, none of this kind of data is on our premise. All data is on the premise of the partner, which is also critical here. Only aggregated data, the one that we're plotting, can leave that site. So no raw IP addresses will be exported there, and we are basically relying on the data that the partners are anyhow collecting. So this is data that is necessary for the operation of these networks and not data that is collected for the purpose of the research. We are just taking advantage of that.
Okay, thank you.
Right, so we gotta move on, so we have to finish. I know we have some other questions as well. With that, it's good to know about the ethical part. But with that, I would like to wrap up the session and give our token of appreciation to Dr. Feldmann. So this is the certificate for you, and this is
Thank you.
as well. And we have one more thing actually for next year. We would like to see you as an author. So our steering committee said like we have a free registration for you, and if you submit papers and as an author, we would like to see you here next year as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So we're gonna have a break, a coffee break, and at 10:30 we're gonna meet with our best paper session.